You're standing in the slave markets of Baghdad in the year 847, watching something that will haunt your dreams forever. The morning sun casts long shadows across the dusty courtyard as merchants arrange their human merchandise with the same care they might display fine silks or precious spears. But these aren't ordinary slaves destined for fieldwork or household service. These are boys, some barely past their 10th birthday, being prepared for a fate that no child should ever face. The slave trader runs his weathered hands through a young boy's hair, checking its texture and color, while potential buyers circle like vultures. The child's eyes are wide with terror, darting between the faces of strangers who examine him as if he were livestock. You notice how the trader emphasizes certain qualities, speaking in hushed tones about the boy's beauty, his gentle nature, his potential for training. This isn't a market for laborers. This is a market for human playthings, destined for the harems and private chambers of the most powerful men in the Islamic world. What you're witnessing isn't just slavery, it's the systematic commodification of childhood innocence, a trade so lucrative and so embedded in medieval Islamic society that it shaped the very foundations of political power across the Middle East. The boys being sold here will disappear behind palace walls, their identities erased, their childhood stolen, all to satisfy the appetites of emperors who could afford to buy anything, including human souls. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The trade in boys for imperial harems wasn't a hidden scandal whispered about in dark corners. It was an open, thriving industry that operated with the full knowledge and protection of the most powerful rulers in the medieval world. From the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad to the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople, from the Fatimid dynasty in Cairo to the Umayyad palaces in Cordoba, the purchase and training of young boys for sexual service was as routine as buying horses for the cavalry or hiring scribes for the bureaucracy. But to understand how this horrific system functioned, we need to step back and examine the twisted logic that made it not just acceptable, but desirable to the medieval Islamic elite. The concept of the harem itself was built on the principle of sexual exclusivity and control. A ruler's power wasn't just measured by the size of his armies or the wealth of his treasury, but by his ability to possess and control the most beautiful and exotic human beings available in his empire. The acquisition process began in the slave markets that dotted every major city in the Islamic world. These markets operated according to well-established rules and customs that had evolved over centuries. Merchants who specialized in the boy trade developed networks that stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the villages of Eastern Europe, from the mountains of the Caucasus to the trading posts of East Africa. The most prized boys came from specific regions known for producing children with particular physical characteristics. Circassian boys from the Caucasus Mountains were coveted for their fair skin and delicate features. Turkish boys from the Anatolian highlands were valued for their supposed loyalty and trainability. Slavic boys captured in raids along the Byzantine frontier brought premium prices for their blonde hair and blue eyes. African boys from Nubia and Ethiopia were sought after for their exotic appearance and rumored stamina. The selection criteria used by slave traders were disturbingly precise and methodical. Boys were examined naked in front of potential buyers, their bodies scrutinized for any imperfections that might reduce their value. Traders looked for smooth, unblemished skin, symmetrical features, bright eyes, and what they euphemistically called graceful bearing. Age was crucial, with boys between 8 and 14 commanding the highest prices. Too young, and they were considered not ready for training. Too old, and they were thought to be set in their ways and difficult to mold. But physical beauty was only part of the equation. Buyers also looked for psychological traits that would make a boy suitable for harem life. Shyness was preferred over boldness, compliance over defiance, intelligence over dullness, but not too much intelligence that might lead to rebellion. The ideal candidate was a child who could be broken down psychologically and rebuilt according to his master's specifications. The pricing structure of the boy trade reveals just how valuable these children were to their purchasers. A prime specimen, a boy of exceptional beauty from a desirable ethnic background, could cost more than a house in the merchant quarter of Baghdad. Records from the 10th century show that beautiful Circassian boys sometimes sold for prices equivalent to what a skilled craftsman might earn in 5 years of labor. These weren't impulse purchases, but significant investments that required careful consideration and substantial financial resources. The most wealthy and powerful buyers maintained agents whose sole job was to scour the slave markets of major cities, looking for boys who met their master's specific preferences. These agents were connoisseurs of human flesh, capable of evaluating a child's potential with the same expertise that horse traders used to assess a stallion's bloodlines. They carried detailed instructions about their employers' tastes, down to preferred hair color, eye shape, and even personality traits. The Caliph al-Muqtadir, who ruled the Abbasid Empire from 908 to 932, was known to employ a team of buyers who traveled constantly throughout his realm, purchasing boys for his personal collection. Contemporary sources describe his harem as containing over 3,000 individuals, with hundreds of them being young boys selected for their beauty and trained for his pleasure. The logistics alone of maintaining such a collection required an entire bureaucracy dedicated to procurement, training, and management. The buying process itself was conducted with the formality of any major commercial transaction. Contracts were drawn up specifying the boy's age, origin, physical condition, and any guarantees about his health or behavior. Buyers often insisted on trial periods during which they could return a purchase if the boy proved unsatisfactory. Insurance policies protected buyers against the death or illness of their investment during transport to their final destination. What made this trade particularly sinister was how it was justified and normalized within medieval Islamic society. Religious scholars developed elaborate theological arguments explaining why the purchase and sexual use of young male slaves was not only permissible, but actually beneficial to all parties involved. They argued that boys rescued from pagan lands and brought into Islamic households would be exposed to the true faith and have opportunities for advancement they never would have experienced in their original communities. The concept of slavery itself was deeply embedded in Islamic law and practice, with detailed regulations governing the treatment of slaves and the rights of masters. But the sexual use of young boys occupied a particular gray area in religious jurisprudence. While some scholars condemned it as contrary to natural order, others found ways to rationalize it as a form of training or education. The boys weren't seen as victims, but as fortunate recipients of their master's attention and resources. This theological cover provided the intellectual framework that allowed the boy trade to flourish without serious moral challenge from religious authorities. In fact, many of the most prominent religious figures of the medieval period were themselves owners of boy slaves, including judges, theologians, and mosque officials who publicly preached about morality while privately participating in the system they should have condemned. The economic incentives that drove the trade were enormous and touched every level of society. Slave traders grew wealthy from their human merchandise, while the regions that supplied boys developed entire economies based on the capture and sale of children. Nomadic tribes launched raids specifically to acquire boys for sale in urban markets. Poverty-stricken families sometimes sold their own sons to traders, convincing themselves that their children would have better lives as palace slaves than as free peasants. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the system was how it created its own demand. The more boys that emperors and wealthy nobles accumulated, the more they wanted. Collections became status symbols, with rulers competing to own the most beautiful or exotic specimens. The appetite for novelty meant that boys who lost their youthful appearance or fell out of favor were quickly replaced by newer acquisitions, creating a constant demand for fresh victims. The training process that awaited purchased boys was designed to strip away their original identities and remake them into perfect instruments of their master's pleasure. This psychological reconstruction was as important as any physical preparation, and it began the moment a boy was sold. The journey from the slave market to the imperial palace was the first stage of a boy's transformation from human being to property. These children were transported in caravans that moved like traveling nightmares across the medieval landscape, chains rattling against cobblestones as they carried their human cargo toward an uncertain fate. The merchants who organized these expeditions understood that their merchandise required special care, not out of compassion, but because damaged goods brought lower prices. The boys were kept in covered wagons to protect their skin from the sun, fed carefully controlled diets to maintain their appearance, and monitored constantly to prevent suicide attempts. Many children, realizing the horror that awaited them, tried to end their lives during transport. The traders countered this by keeping the boys under constant surveillance, removing anything that could be used for self-harm, and using a combination of drugs and psychological manipulation to maintain compliance. Upon arrival at their destination, the boys faced their first encounter with the palace systems designed to process and transform them. These weren't crude operations run by ignorant brutes, but sophisticated institutions that had perfected the art of human modification over centuries. The palaces of medieval Islamic rulers contained specialized facilities staffed by experts in breaking down and rebuilding human personalities. The initial processing began with complete physical examination by palace physicians who documented every aspect of a boy's condition. These medical records weren't kept for the child's welfare, but to track the investment and monitor changes over time. The doctors noted height, weight, physical development, and any signs of disease or defect that might affect the boy's value or performance. Following the medical evaluation came the psychological assessment, conducted by palace officials who specialized in evaluating human potential. These experts had developed techniques for determining which boys could be molded into compliant servants and which might prove troublesome. They looked for signs of strong will that needed to be broken, family attachments that required severing, and religious or cultural beliefs that conflicted with their new role. The most valuable boys were separated from the general slave population and assigned to special quarters within the palace complex. These facilities were designed to be both luxurious and confining, offering comfort while making escape impossible. The rooms were beautifully decorated with silk hangings and precious carpets, but the windows were barred and the doors locked from the outside. The transformation process began immediately with the assignment of new names and identities. The boys' original names were forbidden, replaced with Arabic or Turkish appellations that reflected their new status. They were given new clothes, new hairstyles, and new ways of speaking that erased their cultural origins. This systematic destruction of identity was crucial to breaking down resistance and creating psychological dependence on their masters. Language training was one of the first educational priorities, not because communication was valued for its own sake, but because linguistic control was a form of psychological domination. Boys were forbidden to speak in their native tongues and punished severely for any lapse. They were forced to learn Arabic, Turkish, or Persian, depending on their location, but their vocabulary was carefully limited to words and phrases appropriate to their servile status. The educational curriculum extended far beyond language, encompassing skills deemed necessary for their future roles. They learned music and dance, not as artistic expression, but as forms of entertainment for their masters. They studied poetry and literature, but only works that reinforced themes of submission and devotion. They were trained in various crafts and domestic skills, always with the understanding that their abilities existed solely to please their owners. Physical training was equally important and far more sinister in its implications. The boys were taught to move with grace and elegance, to adopt postures and gestures that emphasized their beauty and availability. They learned to apply cosmetics and perfumes, to arrange their clothing in ways that enhanced their appeal, and to present themselves as living works of art, designed for their master's aesthetic pleasure. But the most disturbing aspect of their training involved explicit preparation for sexual service. Palace instructors, often former slaves who had survived the system and earned positions of limited authority, taught the boys techniques and behaviors that no child should ever learn. These lessons were presented as education, as valuable skills that would ensure the boys' survival and advancement within the palace hierarchy. The psychological manipulation employed during this training phase was remarkably sophisticated. The instructors used a combination of reward and punishment, hope and SPD learned helplessness, boyser to create emotional dependence and more comfortable quarters. Those who res small privileges, better food, or who showed aptitude and compliance were given faced isolation, hunger, and physical punishment that left no visible marks but caused lasting psychological damage. The timeline for this transformation varied depending on the individual boy and his intended role, but the process typically took between 6 months and 2 years. During this period, the children were systematically stripped of everything that had made them who they were and rebuilt according to their master's specifications. By the end of their training, many had lost not just their freedom, but their very sense of self. The most successful graduates of this horrific education were those who learned to find identity and purpose in their servitude. They developed what psychologists today would recognize as Stockholm Syndrome, forming emotional attachments to their captors and finding meaning in their ability to please those who had destroyed their childhood. These boys became the most valued members of the harem, trusted with greater responsibilities, and sometimes achieving positions of significant influence within the palace hierarchy. The training facilities themselves were marvels of medieval architecture and organization, designed specifically for their grim purpose. The Abbasid palaces in Baghdad contained entire wings dedicated to the housing and education of boy slaves, with dormitories, classrooms, bathing facilities, and specialized chambers for various forms of instruction. These areas were carefully separated from the rest of the palace complex, creating isolated worlds where normal social rules didn't apply. The staff required to operate these training programs represented a significant investment in human resources. Each facility employed dozens of instructors, supervisors, guards, and support personnel, creating an entire economy built around the systematic abuse of children. Many of these employees were themselves former slaves who had been promoted within the system, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of exploitation where victims became victimizers. The graduation ceremonies that marked the end of a boy's training were elaborate affairs that celebrated not the child's achievements, but the master's acquisition of a perfected possession. These events served multiple purposes, demonstrating the ruler's wealth and taste, while also serving as marketing opportunities for the slave traders and trainers who had participated in the transformation process. The boys who emerged from these graduation ceremonies were no longer recognizable as the terrified children who had been dragged from slave markets months or years earlier. They moved with calculated grace, spoke in carefully modulated voices, and had learned to mask any trace of their original personalities behind facades of perfect compliance. But beneath these polished exteriors lay broken spirits and fractured psyches that would never fully heal. The assignment process that followed graduation was perhaps even more dehumanizing than the training itself. Palace officials would parade the newly prepared boys before their imperial masters like living catalogues of available pleasure. The rulers would examine each candidate with the same detached interest they might show when selecting a new horse or piece of jewelry, commenting on physical attributes and asking about specific skills or capabilities. The Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, who ruled Egypt from 996 to 1021, was notorious for his elaborate selection rituals. He would spend entire afternoons reviewing newly trained boys, having them perform various demonstrations of their abilities while he lounged on silk cushions, sipping wine and discussing their merits with his advisors. The boys stood silent and motionless during these evaluations, having learned that any sign of discomfort or reluctance would result in immediate punishment. The criteria used for assignment revealed the twisted psychology of their masters. Some rulers preferred boys who reminded them of their own lost youth, while others sought children who looked nothing like themselves or anyone they had known. Certain emperors collected boys from specific ethnic groups, treating human diversity like a hobby that required constant expansion. Others focused on particular skills or talents, assembling what they called orchestras of beauty that could provide both visual and auditory entertainment. The living conditions that awaited the boys varied dramatically depending on their master's preferences and their own success in pleasing him. The most favored might find themselves housed in luxurious apartments within the palace complex, surrounded by fine furnishings and attended by servants of their own. These privileged few lived lives of material comfort that would have been unimaginable to free children of their social class. But this comfort came at the ultimate price of their humanity and dignity. The daily routines imposed on harem boys were designed to maximize their availability while maintaining their aesthetic appeal. They rose before dawn for elaborate grooming rituals that could take hours to complete. Every aspect of their appearance was scrutinized and perfected by teams of specialists who treated their bodies like works of art, requiring constant maintenance. Hair was styled according to the latest fashions, skin was treated with expensive oils and cosmetics, and clothing was selected to enhance their natural beauty. The meals provided to harem boys were carefully planned to maintain their physical condition while also serving as another form of control. Palace nutritionists developed special diets designed to keep the boys slender and youthful-looking for as long as possible. Certain foods were forbidden entirely, while others were provided in measured quantities at specific times. Even eating became another aspect of their lives that was completely controlled by others. The entertainment duties required of harem boys went far beyond the obvious sexual services that defined their primary purpose. They were expected to be accomplished conversationalists, capable of discussing literature, philosophy, and current events with intelligence and wit. They learned to play multiple musical instruments, to compose poetry that flattered their masters, and to perform dances that combined artistic expression with sensual appeal. The most successful boys became genuine companions to their masters, serving as confidants and advisors on matters both personal and political. This intimate access to power sometimes allowed them to accumulate influence that extended far beyond their official status as slaves. Some harem boys became de facto ministers, using their relationships with rulers to shape policy and advance their own interests within the palace hierarchy. But this apparent success came with its own forms of degradation. Boys who achieved positions of influence found themselves competing constantly with newer arrivals, knowing that their master's affections could shift at any moment. They lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, understanding that their elevated status depended entirely on their ability to remain pleasing and useful to men whose moods and desires could change without warning. The punishment systems employed within imperial harems were designed to maintain absolute control while avoiding visible damage that might reduce a boy's aesthetic value. Physical beatings were rare, replaced by more subtle forms of torture that caused psychological rather than bodily harm. Boys who displeased their masters might be isolated in dark chambers for days or weeks, deprived of human contact until they begged for forgiveness and the chance to return to their servile duties. The most feared punishment was sale to a lesser master or assignment to more degrading duties within the palace complex. Boys who had grown accustomed to luxury and relative privilege found the prospect of losing their status more terrifying than death itself. This fear of downward mobility served as a powerful motivator, encouraging compliance and competition among the harem members. The medical care provided to harem boys reflected their status as valuable property rather than human beings deserving of compassion. Palace physicians monitored their health carefully, but their primary concern was maintaining the boys' market value rather than their well-being. Treatments focused on preserving youthful appearance and sexual function, with little attention paid to the psychological trauma that universally affected these children. The aging process presented particular challenges within the harem system. Boys who had been prized for their youthful beauty inevitably grew older, developing the physical characteristics of adult men that reduced their appeal to masters who preferred childlike features. The palace hierarchies had developed elaborate systems for managing this transition, with older boys sometimes being assigned to train newcomers or perform administrative duties that kept them within the system while acknowledging their diminished sexual value. The most successful former harem boys occasionally achieved positions of genuine authority within the imperial administration. The Mamluk system in Egypt and Syria was built partly on this principle, with former slaves rising to become military commanders and government officials. But even these success stories cannot obscure the fundamental horror of a system that destroyed childhood to create instruments of adult pleasure. The international networks that supplied boys to imperial harems operated with the efficiency of any major commercial enterprise. Traders maintained detailed records of their inventory, tracking which types of boys were in demand at different courts and adjusting their procurement strategies accordingly. They developed sophisticated transportation systems that could move human cargo across vast distances while maintaining the quality that their customers expected. The seasonal patterns of the trade reflected both practical considerations and the preferences of buyers. Spring and summer were peak seasons for new acquisitions, when travel conditions were favorable and buyers had completed their review of existing inventory. The major Islamic holidays often coincided with increased demand, as rulers sought to mark religious celebrations with additions to their collections. The correspondence between traders and their imperial customers reveals the casual brutality with which this commerce was conducted. Letters discuss boys in the same language used for any other luxury goods, with detailed descriptions of physical attributes, behavioral characteristics, and special features that might justify premium pricing. These documents, preserved in various archives across the former Islamic world, provide chilling evidence of how completely human beings were reduced to commercial commodities. The marble corridors of those ancient palaces still stand today, transformed into museums where tourists admire architectural beauty while remaining ignorant of the human suffering that once echoed through those halls. The elaborate mosaics and golden decorations they photograph were built on foundations of broken childhoods and shattered innocence. The system that created this horror has long since crumbled, but its legacy remains in the historical records that document one of humanity's most systematic forms of exploitation. These boys, whose names we will never know, whose faces have been lost to time, whose voices were silenced by the machinery of imperial power, deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in the grand narratives of medieval empires, but as individual human beings who suffered unimaginable trauma so that emperors could indulge their darkest appetites. Their stories remind us that behind every golden age, every period of cultural flourishing, every empire celebrated for its achievements, there often lies a foundation built on human misery. The trade in boys for harem pleasure represents more than just historical curiosity or shocking revelation about past practices. It serves as a stark reminder of what happens when human beings are reduced to commodities, when power operates without moral constraints, and when entire societies develop systems to rationalize the unthinkable. The emperors who bought these children were not monsters from mythology, but real men who held real power and made conscious choices about how to use it. Today, we tell ourselves that we have evolved beyond such barbarism, that our modern world, with its human rights declarations and international laws, has moved past the systematic exploitation of children. But the fundamental dynamics that created the medieval boy trade still exist in different forms. Children still disappear into systems designed to exploit them. Powerful people still use wealth and influence to satisfy appetites that destroy innocent lives. The victims may be hidden better, the justifications more sophisticated, but the essential transaction remains unchanged. The silence that surrounded this trade for centuries continues today in different forms. We prefer not to examine too closely the systems that provide our comfort and convenience, just as medieval societies chose not to question practices that served the interests of their ruling classes. The boys who suffered in imperial harems paid the price for this willful blindness, and their modern counterparts continue to pay it today. These forgotten children call out to us across the centuries with a simple message that transcends time and culture. They remind us that every human being possesses inherent dignity that cannot be bought or sold, that childhood innocence deserves protection rather than exploitation, and that the true measure of any civilization lies not in its monuments or achievements, but in how it treats its most vulnerable members.